Hello and welcome to Conversations. I'm Jim Below, your host. Very pleased to have joining me today State Senator Jeff Irwin, representing the 18th District, which is what? Washtenaw County in simple terms.
That's right. Thanks for having me on again, Jim.
Great. And as State Senator, you're now finishing up your first sort of year as a State Senator,
That's right.
but not your first year in Lansing.
Yeah, that's right. I had the honor of serving as state representative for the 53rd District, which is wholly contained within the city of Ann Arbor, from 2011 through 2016. And then I had a couple years out of the legislature, and now I've had the opportunity to come back and represent this great community again.
Now, in the different times, this is different, isn't it? I mean, have you been in a position where you had a split partisan sort of ruling of the legislative and the executive branch? Or has it always been that you've been in the minority throughout?
Yeah, so this time's a little different for me. I'm once again in the minority in the state Senate. I have served in the minority in the state House the whole time I was there. However, when I was in the state House, of course, Governor Snyder was our governor. We had one-party rule. Now we have a situation where we've got a Democratic governor and a Republican-led legislature, which creates interesting opportunities for success and failure.
How have you seen that being different this first year with that?
Well, the biggest thing that was different was how the budget got handled. I've never seen it before where the legislature really refused to work with the governor and to sit down at the table and hammer out all the details necessary to have a workable state budget.
Publicly.
Absolutely, or even privately,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
I've never seen a situation like that. Even in times when I was a lot younger and I was watching state government from afar and there was divided government, it seemed like there was always an effort to really hammer it out at least. And this time, those talks broke down, I think, over road funding. And eventually the legislature sent the governor a budget that hadn't really been negotiated in any meaningful way with the governor. And of course there was a lot of line item vetoes, and it's been it's been an ugly.
And also a matter of timeliness, because it was not presented to the governor until very late in the process. And
that's
according
exactly
to the Constitution, was October 1 the new budget has to have been approved by?
That's right. The state's fiscal year is October 1 through October 1, and if you don't have a state budget before October 1, state government's got to shut down. And so the legislature, and I think very strategically, if you want to give them credit for this, waited until the very last minute to give it to the governor, knowing that that would make it harder for her to veto the budget and send it back for more negotiations. Right. And so they really played. That's right. They played brinksmanship with that, and then as a response, she used the line item veto in a way that really took a lot of programs and put them into an uncertain future. Right. And so it's been a difficult year, really, because I don't think that the legislature and the governor have figured out how to work together yet.
You mentioned that there were items that got, you could say, vetoed. Those projects and programs have not been funded since October 1. Well, but okay, go ahead.
Well, actually, we just passed, you're right, they have not yet been funded, but just in the last week, there's been a real coming together, and we passed a supplemental budget that's going to solve that problem for most of those programs. So of all of the budget items that the governor line item vetoed, there was about $940 million of funding that was vetoed and sent back to the legislature for reconsideration. We've just passed a budget that fills about half of that. Okay. And all of the items in the area of human services and most of the items in the areas of education and other priorities were taken care of. The real outstanding issue is still the roads. The Republicans had included about $400 million in general fund dollars that they wanted to put into a partial solution to roads and potholes, and that's the money that's still on the table.
Okay. Now, when you say it's been approved, has that been approved by both the House and the Senate and signed by the governor yet?
Not quite. It's on the way to the House, but it looks like from all indications that there's a deal, three-part deal between the House and the Senate and the governor, at least on this roughly $500 million of that $900 million variance.
And you mentioned that the process of putting this all together was another issue. And in this compromise, my understanding is there are some things about timing of when the legislature must present to the governor a budget, and then what authority or power the governor in the future might have in redistributing financial aspects of the budget.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation happening about that. I'm here to tell you that's all window dressing.
Oh, okay.
So as part of the compromise, the legislature is going to adopt a statute saying that we have to get the budget done by July 1st. But what if we don't?
Okay.
I mean, everybody already knows that there's been a long-standing sort of unspoken deadline of June 1st. Well, now they're setting a deadline of July 1st, but if the legislature violates that deadline next year, there's no enforcement, there's no penalty. It's really just a political statement to say that we want to get it done by July 1st.
And in some ways is that the whole issue that one legislative session can't limit or prohibit a future legislative group from doing certain things.
That's exactly right, and you know, unless you're going to put some sort of penalty in there or something. Some people have suggested maybe the legislators shouldn't get paid if there's some
Right.
sort of delay in budgeting. So you know, really, I think it's a good goal. We should get the budget done certainly by June 1, certainly definitely by July 1. Our schools and our local governments are depending upon those numbers to make their budgets. You know, but the fact that we're passing this law, I don't think is meaningful.
You mentioned earlier that as of October 1, if a budget has not been approved, that the state has to pretty much shut down. Can, at the state level, the legislature pass any type of a continuation budget as you negotiate to allow what was in effect for 2018-19 to continue until such time that a formal, you could,
Yes.
like the federal government's
Yeah,
known
it's a
to
little
do.
different than the federal government because you know, the state government can't do any deficit spending, and you know, but if the legislature authorizes spending and the governor
At the
signs
same
it,
level that it had been and continue on until.
that's a budget, and those dollars are appropriated and they can be spent for the benefit of the people of Michigan.
Okay, other than the budget, where else has there been efforts at compromise that maybe we would not have seen when one party or the other had the majority of both the executive and legislative branches?
Well, there's a couple areas of compromise and opportunity that are really exciting to me right now. One is around human services and how we care for our elderly and disabled residents, and another is around criminal justice reform. I would say that right now there is a real bipartisan moment happening around criminal justice reform. We've already passed legislation to raise the age. What that does is it says that 17-year-olds who previously were always treated as adults will now generally be treated as juveniles unless someone tries to waive them into the adult system and has a case to make around that.
So the assumption is they would be tried as juveniles, and you'd have to somehow justify or get the court to accept them being tried as an adult.
Basically, yes. And now we're talking about a broad policy of allowing folks greater opportunities for expunging their record. So folks who have a criminal record for one thing or another, currently the rules for that are very, very restrictive, and we've had some bills pass the House, and they're now on their way to the Senate Judiciary Committee where I sit, where we're going to talk about hopefully how to make those even better to give more people an opportunity for a second chance. So there's a lot of good things happening in criminal justice.
Now, would that be for any individual, or I know one of the discussions dealt with juveniles again, and whether or not, you know, as an adult, those who have been tried as an adult under the law in the past, would they be able to get things removed with the new law?
It's somewhat complicated. It depends upon what your offense was and how many offenses you have and all of that. To give you the Cliff Notes version, currently you can only even ask for a set aside of your record if you have up to 1 felony and up to 2 misdemeanors. If you got 3 misdemeanors, even if they're petty, you can't even ask to have them taken off your record. And we've got lots of people, hundreds of thousands of people who have records like this. And so what these bills broadly do is they say, if you've done your time and you've stayed out of trouble for a period of time afterwards, we're going to clear your record. And you know, and it also expands the number of felonies and misdemeanors that you can have and still come to the court and ask for a set aside of your record. And that's going to wipe away a lot of barriers to employment and education for a lot of folks who might have done something at one point in their life that was criminal, but you know, have lived a life that shows that they have no indication that they're going to reoffend. Now, the piece about juveniles is one that I'm adding. I just introduced last week a couple of bills, bipartisan bills, to provide for the records of juveniles to be more confidential, and for juveniles to have similar opportunities to seek to have their records set aside. So if you've done something when you're young, you know, you should also be able to ask to have that taken off your record. And so there's some good bipartisan work happening on those scores there. I'm also really excited about some opportunities in human services and substance abuse treatment.
Listening to your comments about the criminal justice system and the potential changes there, I've got to wonder, why wouldn't those have been brought up? Because those don't seem to be really partisan issues where you had a Republican legislature and a Republican governor as compared to now with the Democratic governor. I mean, why are the Republicans who still control the House and Senate willing to bring those forward now?
Well, I think this has been bubbling up for a long time on the right side of the political spectrum. I think that because of the influence of certain big players in the Republican Party, certain donors, other things like that, there's just been a bubbling up of interest on the Republican side in criminal justice reform. I think the other thing that has changed conservatives' views on the criminal justice system is how the opioid crisis has hit rural communities. I think that sometimes folks who had previously had a lock them up and throw away the key kind of attitude, when they see people in their community getting caught up into that vortex of addiction, that suddenly they realize that maybe that's not the right approach, and that there's a better, more productive approach for society to take to opioid addiction, for instance.
Mentioning the expungement of a record in that, one of the things that just as of December 1st has occurred or thereabouts, and that deals with the state legalizing use of marijuana. Has there been discussion of getting rid of, either freeing those who are in jails and prisons now because of past conviction of a law that no longer would they even be arrested for?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about this. As part of that package of bills around expungements and set aside people's record, there is a piece of that that deals specifically with cannabis. I've introduced a bill on this, Senate Bill 416. What my bill says is that if you've got a very, very low level cannabis crime, possession or use, that it would be automatically taken off your record.
You wouldn't have to apply for it.
That's right. You wouldn't have to pay money, and our local courts wouldn't have to pay money and process all that paperwork, which is a benefit as well. And there's about 235,000 people in the state of Michigan who have a low-level cannabis crime. And then for folks who have a higher-level cannabis crime, maybe a manufacturer or something like that, which is also now legal if you're keeping it within certain limits, those folks would have additional opportunities to apply and go to the court and try to get that taken off. And I think that right now there's a broad agreement between Democrats and Republicans that now that it's legal, the people have spoken, the legislature has some work to do to come back and say, well, let's give a chance for exoneration for those folks who got in trouble for what's now legal. But I do think that there's some disagreement about where exactly that line should be drawn.
Right. And that's where the discussion, but at least a more willingness to discuss.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a short break, come back and look at, you mentioned some environmental issues and other things going on. Ask our viewers to stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment.
CTN Sports, bringing local sports to you.
Uh-oh, you've just discovered that you are a senior citizen. What do you do now? Well, one thing you can do is watch Senior Moments. You'll be encouraged as you learn about activities, meet interesting people, and discover that there really is a lot for you to do. The show also provides information about health, finances, and entertainment. So don't miss Senior Moments to make your senior life better than ever.
We've been Ann Arbor's home for art education for over a century. Our classes, for all ages and skill levels, are a great place to meet people and get creative. We offer courses in painting, drawing, clay and jewelry, as well as courses in our art lab like digital painting and animation. Check out our list of classes and come on over and have some fun.
Greasy pizza boxes.
Ugh, glass bottles not emptied.
Yogurt containers with... Ew! Cat food still in the can is bad.
But oh, so good.
Hey, what are you doing?
Relax, Mom. We're here to help.
Oh, this stuff could ruin the entire recycling load.
Wow. I had no idea.
Chill. We'll show you the ropes.
Michigan needs to recycle better, and that change starts with you. Learn the rules of recycling at recyclingraccoons.org.
Hello and welcome back to Conversations. I'm speaking today with State Senator Jeff Irwin. And prior to the break, one of the things you mentioned that things are being worked on is the environment. And what types of things do you see 2020 potentially environmentally looking like for the state, and how we might see some changes?
Well, there are a lot of big issues in the environment. A couple that I would point out would be energy and infrastructure. So on the energy front, I've had a lot of success, I think, working with my colleague Yusuf Rabi in the House, trying to expand the opportunities for home-based energy generation. Oftentimes that's solar. The rules for that in Michigan have been made very frustrating for the people who want to put solar on their home, or the people who are the contractors who want to install it. And we think there's a better, more fair way to organize that, and we're going to continue talking about that. One of the other big...
And how Edison and the companies then have to either use or accommodate those who have put on the solar panels.
That's right, that's right. And how can we make sure that citizens get a fair shake out of that system when they want to plug in and contribute to our energy future? Another big piece that I think is definitely going to be coming in a way that the citizens of Michigan are going to have to deal with is, what are we doing with water infrastructure? Right. Everybody's talking about the roads because the roads are a mess, and you drive on them every day, you see them, you can't avoid seeing it, right? But we've got this buried infrastructure, this infrastructure that's been underground that you don't see every day, but that is absolutely vital to getting clean water to our taps, and that's absolutely vital to carry our sewage away from us.
And it's not just one city that has it, where 4 years ago, it seemed like all the focus was on Flint.
Yeah, and what happened in Flint is very, very important, but I'm talking about sort of a larger effect, which is that about 70, 80, 90 years ago, as a nation, we were investing heavily in these big projects, sewers, things like that, that were the infrastructure that we really built the current society on. And that work is now fraying at the edges, and we've got huge leakage problems, we've got water quality problems. And if we're going to be ready to continue to operate here in Michigan for the next 50 years, if we're going to be ready for the changing and increasing water levels with climate change, we need to reinvest in our water infrastructure. And there's a lot of folks who are working behind the scenes right now to develop a plan for what would it take for Michigan to really put people to work now, making long-term investments in our infrastructure that will redound to our benefit economically and health-wise going forward.
And I would think that you'd have some of the same issues and concerns and problems funding something like that as with the funding of the infrastructure of the roads.
Yeah, I think the problems are sometimes even greater, because with roads, as much reluctance as there is to increase user fees, at least you have user fees there. You do in the water space as well. People are ratepayers, but we do need to get creative to find ways to finance those very, very large projects in new ways, because we need them to be done, and we're going to be paying for it either way.
And in certain ways, I would think it'd be more difficult because, as you say, it's not something that the average resident is going to feel on a daily basis as they're going to work or they're going shopping and they know the roads are bad.
That's right.
It's when their water supply directly is impacted, or their sewer is impacted, or they have flooding in their basement as a result of the failure to be able to take the runoff.
Yep. Well, those of us like myself who are in positions responsible, to the people here in Michigan, are trying to get out ahead of this problem, right? Because if we wait until we have problems with the cleanliness of our water, if we wait until we have problems with the efficacy of our sewer, then we're going to have huge problems. We need to get out in front of that. And I think PFAS is a great example of how you need to stay on top of these issues, need to be constantly vigilant with respect to water quality.
Now, another issue that has historically been one over the last couple decades, school funding. Yes. You mentioned in the compromise budget that got worked out. But I assume there are still concerns about how much funding and where that money is coming from?
Yeah. The vetoes and that got worked out, but what did not get worked out is the fundamental failure that Michigan has been engaging in for the last 10 or 20 years in funding our schools. So if you look at K-12 schools today, they're getting about 25% less money than they were 15 years ago in inflation-adjusted dollars. And that squeeze is being put on our schools every year. And even this year, in a relatively good economic environment where revenues to the state are increasing, we still gave an increase to K-12. It was an increase, but it was less than inflation. So even in the good years, we're giving K-12 less than inflationary increases, and in the bad years, they're getting cut. If you keep rinsing and repeating that cycle, you're going to get what you have today, which is, it used to be that Michigan was a top 10 state for K-12. We're not anymore. We're in the bottom half. We're threatening to fall into the bottom quartile of education funding, and you're seeing the same thing happen with performance. So the performance that we used to get, which was top of the pack, is now slipping. And I don't think that's the kind of future we want here in Michigan. Schools should be the top priority. We should fund those first. And there's a huge difference between what our schools need to operate at a minimally basic and effective level and what we're giving them now.
How do we get the finances for that?
Well, the big problem I'm having in Lansing right now with that is that the conversation about roads is sucking all the air out of the room, and all the revenue as well. And because
and it's not getting the revenue it needs.
It's not. But you know, right now the roads are pulling about $800 million out of the general fund, depending upon whether or not we end up passing the budget that the Republicans proposed or not. But that's a lot of money. That could really change our K-12 funding regime. That could ensure that every child had access to early childhood education in the state. Those are real dollars that we're putting into roads from our general fund because nobody wants to increase taxes on roads. I can appreciate that. Nobody likes gas taxes. That's the only product that we have posted on every corner. You know, so it's very, very hard. But because we've been unable to do that, and because we've been able to keep pace with our road funding needs, it's schools and mental health that have to lose out. Because when new revenue comes in the door, it's all going to fill that pothole.
Right. Are there programs or projects over the last, let's say, decade that potentially could be looked at and either eliminated? Or, you know, I mean, one of the arguments is one way you get more money is by cutting it somewhere else. In your minds, are there areas that we could look at?
There are, but I would say primarily those areas are nibbling around the edges. So for instance, earlier this year, I introduced a bill that will increase the fees on oil and gas drillers, because in the past, these fees were capped and the program was supposed to be self-sustaining, but it no longer is. So we need to increase the cap so that the citizens of Michigan are no longer subsidizing that industry to the tune of $4 million in this one program. There's $4 million right there that we shouldn't be spending. And you could add up a lot of those. I could give you dozens of them, but it really doesn't add up to enough to really meaningfully change that result for our schools. The reality is that back in the 1970s, we passed the Headley Amendment, which was a historic tax limitation bill. And that set a limit to how much the state could tax total, statewide. And we are currently at about half of that limit.
Okay.
So, you know, that gives folks an idea of what the real issue is here. I'm not saying that we need to be at that limit, but the real issue is that we're at historically low levels of taxation in Michigan. So all these programs that we're talking about, whether it's mental health care, K-12 schools, college affordability, taking care of our seniors who want to age in place, taking care of our parks and natural resources, all of that is trying to survive on about half of the tax effort that, you know, was historically when it was at its high. You know,
when it was that high, was the state taxing it at the upper level?
No,
not quite, but
yeah, so good point. But nonetheless,
as a percentage, it was higher.
It was much higher.
Okay.
It was much higher. And one of the main things that happened when I was in Lansing under Governor Snyder was that we reduced taxes on businesses and wealthy people by about $1 billion a year, a little more. And that has a big effect. You know, every year, that's another $1 billion every year that we don't have to invest in these important priorities.
Local governments, Proposal B, with going back to the funding for education and their limitations as far as what a school district can tax. Has there been any discussion of looking at Proposal B from the early 90s and whether there should be an increase in what a local school district could potentially tax?
Right, so you're referencing Proposal A, which passed in 1994. No, and that really reorganized how we did school funding. The goal was to make it more equitable, and it hasn't really worked, right? And so are there discussions about this? Absolutely. I can tell you that there are discussions in my office. You know, I represent a very unique set of communities, right? I represent Ann Arbor, which is, although it doesn't get enough education funding, at the top of the scale. And I also represent Ypsilanti, which is not at the top of the scale. And Saline as well, right? Not at the top of the scale, and other districts, and Lincoln, Milan. But you know, when you look at that, you think, gosh, none of these schools are getting what they really need to be able to compete. But if we're serious about equity and if we're serious about making sure that we have great schools in every community, we need to find a way to bring that level up to up to that new floor.
Right.
And so we've been talking a lot in my office about how could we rewrite Proposal A. We've been inviting in experts from the school community and others to say, you know, do you have any ideas? How could we redo this in a way that would provide sufficient funding, fair taxation, and fair funding?
Right. As we wind down, other issues that you're going to be working on either because you've introduced or you're considering introducing over the next year that are going to help the citizens in the 18th district.
Yeah, I've got a lot of ones that I'm excited about, but I'll just pick one because I could go on and on with you, Jim. The one that I'm excited about right now that I want to share with you is that in Michigan, we've known for a long time that we've got elders who want to stay at home, who would be happier and healthier if they stayed at home and aged in place, but who are getting pushed to the nursing home. And we know that it's going to be vastly more expensive and they're going to get worse results there, but we make it very, very difficult for folks to get just a little bit of assistance at home. And we do that by paying the people who do that work so little. So that our caregivers, direct care workers, folks who are going into people's homes to help them with cooking and cleaning or to make sure they take their meds and just to make sure that they're getting out in the community, those folks earn so little because the state pays so little that it's hard for our seniors to even find those individuals.
Oh, okay.
I think what we need to do is create a system where our seniors can find quality, reliable, consistent, trustworthy help. And we need to raise that standard with training and the wages to make sure that those people are out there to help our seniors age in place. Because if we do, people will be happier, they'll be healthier, they'll live longer, and if we do it right, it'll cost less because there's nothing more expensive than a nursing home.
Right. And to what extent does the state help defray the cost of the nursing home, or is that something
Oh,
that...
absolutely.
Okay.
Now, I mean, this is a long conversation, but if you're indigent, the state pays full freight, essentially. I mean, obviously they're going to take whatever income you have from Social Security or whatever, but the state's paying out insane amounts of money, and folks need to be cared for. They need to be cared for. But my point is that there's a cheaper, more effective way that most people would choose. And if they can stay in their home longer and be happier and healthier, we should help them do that, even if it means we need to pay a little bit more to keep that service vital and effective.
In looking at all the things that you're looking at and working on, what's the most frustrating one that you are concerned about that realistically you don't see necessarily getting approved yet?
That would probably be road funding, right?
Okay.
And it's not just the road funding itself, but it's also the way we fund roads. The way we do it in Michigan really leaves Southeast Michigan, places like Washtenaw County, places like Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, really leaves us as big donors. And so there's essentially two problems there. One problem is the sufficiency of the amount of dollars, and the other problem is that rural areas get a lot more dollars per
mile or whatever.
Per unit of traffic, certainly. Right? And so those are both really sticky and difficult things to unwind because the people who benefit from the current system aren't eager to change it.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for doing what you've been able to do in Lansing over the last almost 10 years with a few breaks in there, but also for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. And this is the 500th show, I understand.
Right, that's my understanding.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. Appreciate it. And want to thank our viewers for staying with us over these years and look forward to your continued support here on Conversations.